Today we're going to talk about classics, what a classic even is, why you should read a classic, a few reasons why you shouldn't read a classic, and how you can read more of them, even if you've never read one before. Before I impart any pearls of wisdom, I first want to talk about my qualifications, so you know that you're hearing things from a reliable source. From an incredibly young age until I was like 13, I was tearing through classics for academic validation. Obviously schools always recommend that you read them. You will often find them on syllabuses, you know, analysing why the curtains are red, etc, etc. So I read so many classics as a young person, and then I stopped. Not just classics, but reading altogether. So until recently, or until about a year ago, I hadn't really read in 10 years. And I found myself trying to get back into classics, and it's not easy. So I say this because I feel like I have some good kind of mixed experience that I can draw from, because I have the experience of having read a lot of classics and kind of know about them and understand what they're like, but I also have the more recent experience of finding them difficult and sort of really trying to retrain myself to get back into them. And I have some pretty good tips, I think. I've really cracked the code as to how to read classics and how to get the most out of them and enjoy yourself while doing it. First of all, the elephant in the room. What even is a classic? What makes a classic book a classic book? So I did a lot of fervent Googling, and a classic, to my surprise, is not actually very well defined at all. You have book canons, which is actually a more specific term, and that describes collections of books published by universities or by publishers, and that's more specific. That's sort of, you'll describe a book canon for a certain period of time or a certain part of the world, but a classic is actually a pretty poorly defined term. The first thing that a classic often is old. So often they are 100 or around 100 or over 100 years old. Having said this, there are some books that have been declared classics as they were published, but being declared a classic the moment you're published is incredibly rare, and usually these books are older. Although more recently, classics are starting to be divided into modern classics and classics, especially because for so long classics have been dominated by white privileged men for a number of reasons. But it means that when we talk about classics, it's just this sea of books from the viewpoint of one type of person. And understandably, people don't want to read just that viewpoint. And so these days you see a lot of modern classics being published, or a lot of books that aren't quite as old, but are still considered classics. This idea of standing the test of time also brings me on to the second important thing that makes a book a classic, which is literary merit. So a very important thing to note and to keep in mind when considering reading classics and getting into them is the fact that a good book, in terms of like technically literary good book, does not necessarily mean easy to read. And in the case of classics, it actually often means it's quite challenging to read. Also, classics are often the books that kind of define a whole genre of reading or define a certain trope or tropes. And what you'll find is that you might read a book and feel like it's a played out trope now, but really it was the first one to set the trope. So although you are well within your rights to just not read those books because you don't think they're interesting, it's just something to consider. Are you reading it because you want to read something that's fresh from your perspective, or are you reading it because you want to explore the context, you want to think about and experience the first of its kind? So I recently read Frankenstein and I didn't enjoy it, for a number of reasons, to be fair, but one aspect of it was it just didn't feel that original. But it's this funny irony where it actually was the original, but because now we've had so much time pass, so many people drawing inspiration from and kind of copying the story, by the time you then read the original, it doesn't feel original, which is not anyone's fault, but it's just a point I thought I would mention. Another example of this, and I actually haven't read this book, but I've seen a lot of people talk about it in this way, is On the Road by Jack Kerouac, which is meant to be a road trip book, and it was meant to be like the first road trip book of its kind. But since you've seen loads of that type of book, so I think reading it now for some people is a little bit disappointing. And this brings me to a really important point, which is you don't have to enjoy classics. I personally would recommend reading them and recommend putting the time in to try to get into them. But you don't need to read classics to be a reader. You don't need to read classics to be an intellectual, intelligent, good member of society. It's not necessary. It's just something that can be really rewarding if you want to prioritize it and if you want to put the time in. And I think, especially as I mentioned, so many classics are written from this one viewpoint by one type of person, and it's pretty reasonable to be a bit tired of that. And there are so many incredible books that are not classics that are definitely worth your time. The way I would describe it is that there are some books that you just think about for a very, very long time, possibly kind of forever after reading them. It really feels like they've made an impact. And I find more often than not, those books are classics. The most recent one that I feel that way about is East of Eden. I feel like I've been harping on about it, but it's just an example of the richness of the text when it comes to a classic. I see classics as a bit of a marathon or like a challenge. You really have to put in effort, or often you have to put in quite a lot of effort, and it's a little bit of a grind, but you don't get the reward without that grind, and the reward is really, really great. But it's also really important, or valuable in my opinion, to know when to stop. Not all classics are created equal, and you shouldn't be afraid of putting down the books that don't feel like they're sticking. If you are however many pages in and you just feel like you're grinding on and nothing is changing and you can't pay attention, just don't read it. You really don't have to read any book to be a valid reader. So put it down, try a different one. I think something I would say is it's worth having a look at the writing style, doing a little bit of research before you start books, or even while you're reading them, to see if it's a style that you might enjoy, or just to see how the book progresses. I think sometimes books can feel, classic books, they take time to adjust to, and you sort of, when you first start reading the first few pages, you feel as though you will never get used to the way that it's being written, but you actually get used to it quite quickly. So I definitely think it's worth having a bit of a Google and reading about that writer's style and whether the book is something that you might get used to, or whether the style changes, or whether the pace picks up, things like that. It's worth just doing a little bit of research. For example, last year I read Far from the Madding Crowd, and I really enjoyed it. It's by Thomas Hardy, and he is known for his sweeping, descriptive countryside scenes. And I personally feel like it adds loads to the book. I definitely have to put extra effort into focus, but it's kind of worth it for me. But if you're someone who doesn't like very long descriptive passages or doesn't get anything from them, then don't read that book. There are so many incredible books out there. Why would you spend time reading something that you just wouldn't enjoy? So many of them are just harder to read, and it's nothing to do with intellect. It's just because they were written in a totally different time, or they were written in a really specific style. And it's not that you're too stupid to understand them, it's just a case of getting used to them. And so I'd just make sure that you're giving yourself loads of grace when you're trying to get into classics, when you're reading your first few classics. I would make sure to not try to rush them, and don't keep kind of checking the page count and being like, oh, I've spent so long reading this, how am I just on this page? Like, you will have to reread some parts maybe, or make sure that you're really focused and really start to sort of be a bit structured and dedicate time to understanding the book. That just might be something that you need to do, and you shouldn't feel ashamed or disheartened by that. Language just changes so much, and I think if you are a bit intimidated by it, I would just read more recent classics first. As a broad rule, logically, language gets harder to understand the further away from the book publication that you get. And you have a number of classics, some very famous ones that are more recent, that are from kind of the mid 1900s, and it's definitely worth giving those a go before you give the kind of earlier centuries a go. I think also, as a way to kind of make it easier for yourself, read short stories, read poems. It's so much easier, or essays, it's so much easier to just get used to the language if you make it a little bit more bite-sized for yourself. And there's no harm in like giving yourself a little program. So having your list of classic books, having a little bit of researching them, and being like, you know what, this book is going to be a bit of a grind, and I want to be mentally prepared. I want to build up my reading stamina before I get into it, because I want to get the most out of it. So you can put that book a little further down your TBR, and you can prioritize shorter books, or ones that are more recent, or just ones that you've heard are particularly riveting, particularly timeless. Those kind of books will be easier to read, and there's no harm in just like reading them first to ease yourself into it. Now onto my recommendations. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm excited to recommend some, and these recs are definitely beginner friendly. But yeah, these are the ones that I consider to be the most kind of timeless, the ones that I had a really positive experience reading, the ones that I really actually couldn't put down, and had quite good pacing. First of all, a book that I hold so close to my heart is Jane Eyre. This is the ultimate female heroine. I think this was published in the 1800s, but it's one of those books that I cannot believe it's that old, because so much of the writing and the humour and the way that she is described and just her overall story feels genuinely very modern. Like, obviously they talk in a old English way and the things that are going on are kind of old, but she feels like a modern woman, and it's just one of those really brilliant love stories. There are so many quotes from Jane Eyre that I just think are wonderful, and she's an incredible character. So on that note, I would also recommend Little Woman. That is such a beloved book, and it has such, characters that you really fall in love with. And similar to Jane Eyre, Little Woman was made into a film, and loads of books or loads of films have actually been based on classic books. So that's a little tip for you there, if you so wish. I would actually maybe read books that have been made into films, not just because if they were made into films, they're sort of more likely to be timeless, and they're more likely to be easier to follow story. If you've watched the film, you know the story, so it makes it a little bit easier to actually read the book. But if you haven't watched the film, you can read the book, and then you can look forward to kind of rewarding yourself with a watch of the film, and maybe you kind of analyse the characters, you think about how the characters might be different to how you imagine them to be. It's just interesting comparing and contrasting. So just make reading classics a little bit fun. And a final one that I will mention that's kind of on a similar genre is Emma. So Emma is actually known to be a quite easy to read and really quite funny book, and it is what inspired the rom-com Clueless. So that's a fun fact. So all of those books are really great. Pride and Prejudice obviously is another one that falls into that category, although I would say that Pride and Prejudice is that little bit harder to read. The next two are top of my classics reading list, but I haven't actually read them yet. But when I was doing my research, I just saw them everywhere, so I thought they were worth mentioning. Pedro Paramo is a book that is set in Mexico. It's said to be the inspiration for 100 Years of Solitude, and it's kind of a story of someone searching for their heritage and finding out about their ancestry. and it's meant to be really incredible, really gripping. And then the other one is The Picture of Dorian Gray. This is meant to be really, really beautifully written, and it's meant to be quite easy to read, and it's also meant to be a really kind of unique story. So I'm looking forward to reading that, and maybe you can read along too. You can have a read of it if you haven't already. So yeah, those two I haven't read, but I've been recommended. If you've read them, let me know what you think of them. Next, this is one that is on a lot of school reading lists, and that is The Great Gatsby. A lot of people, this is their kind of all-time favorite book. It is 200 pages long, so pretty manageable, and it's set in the US in the Jazz Age. So it's a very kind of vibrant, quite fast-paced book, and F. Scott Fitzgerald's writing style is just so easy to read. You really can kind of tear through it, and this is the kind of book that you can read in one sitting really easily. Finally, I've mentioned it a little bit in this video, but I'm in love with East of Eden, and East of Eden is definitely not quite welcome on this list because it is not completely beginner friendly, but it's definitely one that I would recommend working towards because the characters and the story, it's just so gripping. It really is a book that makes you think about so many deep themes and really makes you think about human behaviour, what it means to be human. And so yeah, I'm really interested though. That was obviously a completely incomplete list. Let me know in the comments if you have any classics that you would recommend to a beginner, or whether you disagree, or whether you've tried to read some of these classics and you haven't really enjoyed them or got into them. I'm intrigued. I've really enjoyed this slightly like advice style video, so let me know if you have any questions. Obviously I'm not the wisest owl of the owls, but there are some things in this brain. Anyway, thank you for watching. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, and have a lovely week. Goodbye.